a few minutes of a few minutes of like some guided writing. So let's start off with the memoir. I'm going to take half an hour, so we're going to end at 12:38. Um, and we're going to talk about the memoir. So the memoir is this, or the autobiography is this thing about your own life. And so most people come to me and say, oh, Sheena, you know, I have this book in my head. I've been waiting to write it. My life, everyone says that my life needs to be a story. And and I think that is amazing, and I think that everyone should really share their story. But there's just a few pieces that are going to be really important. So when you start writing your memoir, you start thinking in lots of pieces. Like, okay, you know, this happened when I was 8, and this happened when I was 16, and this happened when I was 24, and this happened, and so on and so forth. Um, but when we're reading it, we like to see things sort of in a consecutive order, so that there's sort of a wave and a flow. So my first question is, what is the point of you sharing this story with people? Now, most of you will probably answer something like, I want to be inspirational, which is great. I think that everyone needs inspiration and motivation. But you need to be a little bit more specific about what it is you want people to take from your life lessons. For instance, I've seen some stories that what they want their readers to take from it is that they learn how to live a little bit more wholly. They learn how to see a problem and move through it swiftly and gently. So that's one of the things that people do. So instead of just telling a long consecutive story, there's sort of a reason behind it all. So if I tell you that when I was 16, I traveled to Europe, and I spent a lot of time in hostels and things like that. Um, it wouldn't be just because I'm telling you that I went to Europe and I spent time in hostels, which is cool, but that's a story that you tell when you're sitting in the living room. The piece that's really, really important that I want to share is that after you told the story, you got to get to the heart of why you shared it, because all of us have huge stories in our lives. Like everyone has a huge story, a huge, fantastic story. But the point here is that you really get to the heart of the matter. So why are you sharing the story? Why is it that you want people to be engaging with it? So if I tell you that when I was 16, I went to Europe and I spent time there, I want to tell you more about why I'm telling you the story. So the reason I'm telling you the story is because what I learned about myself while I was in Europe was that I am this ethereal being, is that this body doesn't really belong to any one particular land. But what I've learned is that claiming ownership over a country for myself is a little bit complicated because I come from so many lands. And so I share that in sort of a memoir. Actually, I haven't written my memoirs, in fact. And I wonder if I ever will, even though I think everyone should. So at some point, I probably will. Um, but I do think that when you're sharing with us why, you have to give us the reason why. So there's an overarching big reason, big understanding of why you're sharing that information. So here's the next piece. So when you have chapters in your memoir, you're sort of going from like this part of your life to this part of your life to this part of your life to this part of your life. And that is really important. But remember that at the end of every chapter, you're sort of going to wrap it around and tell us the big story, the big lesson, the big piece, what you're taking and what you're giving. Right? Because writing is all about sharing with others. So that's the big part about memoir writing that I find really fascinating. So unfortunately, we're having some technical issues, so I won't be able to ask you all live any questions. But when you have questions and you see this later on, please do make sure that you're sending us questions so that I can answer them in the comments below. Um, okay, so the next piece that we're going to look at just a little bit more about memoir writing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say a few things, and then I'm just going to leave you a few minutes to do some writing with it. So I'm going to ask you, you ready? So I need you to take a deep breath, because part of the thing about memoir writing is that it ends up revealing a whole lot about yourself that you haven't thought about in a long time, and maybe don't want to think about. And so not caution you, but I want to offer that when you start writing your memoir, you make sure that you have people in your life that can support you, because it will bring up a whole lot of stuff that you haven't thought about in a while. Um, and so, side note, that's something that's key and important to me when it comes to writing, especially memoirs, is that if you don't have a set support system in your life, you're going to drudge up a whole lot of thoughts that you haven't had, which is important, is very important to do. But you do need to have systems in place to support you when you get to these places, okay? So however that looks for you, if it's a partner, if it is your parents, if it is a friend, if it is a therapist, you're going to be bringing up a lot of memories that you haven't thought about in quite some time, okay? So please, please, please keep that in mind. Now, where was I? Okay, so I'm going to ask you some questions. If I'm hoping that you have a pen and paper or your computer screen, so I'm going to give you a second to get those out. It was a few more than seconds. Okay. So the question I have for you is, what is your point? What is it that your life and your memoirs and your autobiography have that are going to teach me to live better? Or at least teach me to love better? What is your point? The question you're going to put at the top of your page is, what is my point? Okay, I'm going to leave you for 3 minutes and jot note form so that you can sort of gather yourself. What is your point here? Why are you writing this memoir beyond just telling your story? Okay, I'm hoping you have your three main points or three ideas around, like, what is your point? Why are you telling us this story? What is it going to bring to our lives? Okay, now I want you to take another second, and you're going to put a line underneath that. If you're on the computer, that's fine. You're going to make sure that you are saying, no, more technical issues, that's okay. You're going to make sure that you are saying, let me collect my thoughts again. You're going to put the line underneath, okay? And the next question is, how are you going to convey this point? How are you going to convey this message? Now, I know this seems very, very simple and maybe even passé, but the thing is that if we don't have a point to why we're writing something, it's just sort of like when your mom is continually telling you about her gardening. You know what I mean? We all know when our parents tell us something over and over, and we usually say something like, you already told me that, right? And so what we want to avoid in memoir writing is just blabbing on about the same idea over and over, or even blabbing on about something terrible that's happened. As much as our harsh stories are really important to share and they're interesting and fascinating, the other part that we're what I really am hoping that people grab from this is that you understand that there is a bigger piece of why and how. So I want you to write down how you're going to convey this. Is this through stories and humor? Is this through seriousness and scripture? Is this through seriousness and humor? How are you going to get you out onto the page? You can say things like, I'm going to use particular types of punctuation. I'm going to use pictures. I'm going to tell the story. And then on the other side of the page, I'm going to um, give jot notes about why it's important that they hear this. Whatever it is, I need you to tell us how you're going to convey this point. Okay? I'm going to give you another minute for that. Okay. So now that you've told us or told yourself um, your reason, your point, and then you've told us how you're going to get your point across, I want you to tell us, and now this is probably the trickiest part. Oh, did you see that close up? This is probably the trickiest part. But how are you going to close this all up? I mean, like, you're going to open up a whole big can of worms for yourself mostly, but also your work will probably trigger other people's thoughts and feelings. True? I was going to say true or false, but it's true. You know, it will trigger a whole lot of things. So, how are you going to tighten it up and close it all up? How are you going to leave your reader feeling like, I'm so glad I read this because I learned this about this person. I can identify them with them in this way, but I also took this from the book. So, it's always dangerous to write things like in conclusion. And if you write essays, you probably know that, yes, also saying in conclusion ends up being a dangerous thing. But what is it you want to close up with? How are you going to close your story, your personal story? Are you going to leave it sort of as a to be continued? Are you going to offer them some wisdom that you've gathered along your way? Are you going to ask them some questions? Are you going to give them a series of things to attempt and try in their lives? These are the things that you need to be thinking about while you're writing a memoir or your autobiography. Okay? So I'm going to give you one more minute to fill that out and just see what that looks like for you. Okay. So now let's move into some fiction writing. Now remember, this is all I'm doing this so that you can sort of get a taste of the types of things that we'll be doing in the online class. We're not going to, of course, it will be a lot more detailed, and we only have a few minutes left of this webinar. But it's really, really on purpose to get you guys thinking about what you're writing about, because it's beyond you wanting to just tell a random story. It's always about you bringing value to other people, bringing a service to another person that's going to read your work, as well as it being completely cathartic for yourself. That's very important. Okay, so now we're moving on to the fiction section, which is very exciting. And I think that people who write fiction are incredibly powerful and magical. I think anybody who writes anything is magical, because writing is like this heaven-sent behavior. Okay, so if you happen to be writing fiction, I need you to ask yourself a few major questions. Who is your protagonist? What is a protagonist, you ask? Good question. That's your main character. That's your, like, the one who everyone falls in love with. Now, here's the other piece I want you to remember. Because you are probably self-publishing, try to change the mold. You don't always have, how we typically do stories right now is like, you know, we have a beginning, we are introduced to our protagonist, we have, then we're introduced to our antagonist, which we'll talk about in a second, then we have a climax, and then it comes back down. So our plot is filled in there. I don't believe that is the only way to write or tell a story. So try to change the mold, but some of the things that you must have in any fiction story is a protagonist. So however that looks, if it's a human, if it's a monster, if it's a bird, if it's a monkey, I don't know, whoever, whatever it is, tell us about who they are and what do they actually represent in the scheme of things, right? Make us fall in love with them, or make us despise them and later on fall in love with them, but give us some traits that are very serious. So I'm going to give you a minute. Even if you are not a fiction writer, I want you to take a minute and name a character, even if it happens to be yourself, because you can of course use this for your memoir writing as well. Take a second, and if it happens to be that you are your main character and you're writing a memoir, but you're listening to this fiction section, take a minute and you're going to write down your name, and you're going to write down a list of character traits about yourself that are going to be pertinent to us falling in love with you or despising you for a minute and then falling in love with you. So I'm going to give you a minute. So character traits like, so here's some. Talks a lot, is vivacious. So remember, the vivacious is sort of like, woo, right? Life of the party. Or is dangerous and scary and alluring. Or your character could be quick to anger and quick to judgment. All types of things. But in fact, I need you to put 5 things that you're going to describe that are character traits of this person, this protagonist. Okay? I'm going to give you 1 minute for that. Okay. So now the next part is to be asking ourselves a little bit more about the protagonist or the main character. I want you to explain how you're going to tell us about these characters. Like, how you're going to tell us he's funny. Let's just say that our main character's name is Jeffrey, and Jeffrey is a hilarious person. But how are you going to show us that Jeffrey is hilarious? So I need you to give us 3 ways that you're going to describe this. Does he tell jokes throughout the story? Does Jeffrey play tricks on people, and what do those tricks look like? And also, how do people respond to Jeffrey's tricks? Do people laugh hysterically? Do people look at Jeffrey like he's crazy? You're going to have to make some decisions now about Jeffrey and how people respond to Jeffrey. Okay? I'm going to give you another couple seconds to give that a try. Now, if you're feeling stumped with these, don't worry about it. Join the writing class and you will have ample opportunity to really just start developing these further. This is really just a moment to be thinking about these things, where if you're sitting at your cubicle, or, well, I don't know, driving in your car or on the bus, or whatever you do in your day and your night, these are some things to start thinking about, like, who is this character? Okay, so we're moving on to the next part, the antagonist. Now, remember that even fiction writing and memoir writing is quite similar, because usually in our memoirs we have an antagonist, which is the bad guy. That's the one who gives us challenges. That's the one who makes things complicated, and we have to figure out how to come through the other end of it, okay? So this part I find very, very interesting. Now, you're going to do the same thing for the antagonist. Like, what is it about the antagonist that we absolutely despise or absolutely love? Find that interesting? Remember, there's a lot of movies and a lot of books that we watch or read where our antagonist is someone that we just really like we like them, and then we're devastated when we find out that they have these terrible qualities, or we hate them. Do you see what I'm saying? We have to have giant qualities that we connect to quickly, because we have the span of, I don't know, 50 to 4,000 pages kind of thing to get to know these characters. So get very clear about who your antagonist is. Now let's just pretend your antagonist is Veronica. I don't know. I just make up names. And Veronica is like very beautiful, and she has like um, thick curly hair and dark voluptuous skin, but she also happens to be really negative and jealous. Okay? So I'm going to give you a few seconds for that. Okay. So now let's we've got about 7 minutes left. And I'm sure that your juices are sort of flowing a little bit if you've allowed yourself to be unobstructed and undistracted by things that are going on in your world. If you happen to be watching from your phone because you're doing something, make sure your headpiece is in, and give yourself a minute to actually just slow down and connect with this, okay? Because whatever you are writing, whatever you are working on, it's going to need your undivided attention. You won't be able to half-ass this, guys, okay? I just swore in a webinar. Okay, so now I want you to look at the climax, if you will, the part that brings us close to like devastation, um, and decide if you want us to be wholly devastated, or is there a way to reconcile. You're going to have to make some decisions, because you don't have to do this the way that you typically do this, the way that we typically see stories, the way that we typically see movies. You don't have to do it the way that we've been seeing it, but what you will have to do is make some very concrete decisions. Does that make sense? You're going to make some decisions about what you're writing about. And remember, we asked this earlier, what's the point? If your story, I can remember, well, this is many, many years ago, We rented a movie from Blockbuster, so that is a really long time ago. And the movie seemed to have no point. I mean, we followed a group of people as they went on canoe trips, and it was not a documentary, which, by the way, is very interesting. So by the time we completed the movie and we realized there was no real climax, what we did is witness people living on a daily basis. What I found really fascinating was the responses of the rest of the viewers, my friends and family who were also watching this movie with me. Everyone was equally devastated by the fact that there was no climax, save for me. I found this interesting because we are very used to the ways that stories are typically told. So, that being said, if I can tell you that almost everyone else in the room, and there was about 7 other people, were like, what are we watching? What's the point? You might want to think about that when you're writing your book. Now, if you want to change the mold, I, for one, will definitely be with you, but you're going to have to get very clear about your reasons why and how, okay? So let's leave that aside for a minute. And if you happen to want to have that major climax, that part of the plot that like makes everyone devastated and excited all at the same time, I want you to write that down now. Is there an erupting volcano? Is there a baby that's born when she's 12? I don't know. I don't know. Something big that will help us when we're coming back down. So come up with a few main points because remember, in a novel, you might have a few big climaxes. Our characters have to weave their way through all of these things. So write down 2 to 3 climaxes. Okay, so that has been sort of a little taste of what the writing course will look like. I want to guide you through as best I can, getting ready to get your work out to the world. Teaching is my absolute passion beyond my, alongside my children and my family. Um, but I really want to guide you through a way that you can hold yourself accountable and create accountability with other people who will be attending the course as well. My apologies for the technical issues on this one. Not sure what happened, but these things do happen and we make our way through. It's sort of the story of our lives. Get it? Okay. So please make sure you're signing up as soon as possible for the online course where you will be introduced to many other authors, many other writers, many other people desiring to get their work out to the world. And you will be guided by myself and a few other people in terms of how to get your work really moving and flowing the way that you desire it to. I'm Sheena Blake, and I will see you next time. Peace and blessings.